nothing to worry about. And then what are the arguments that would support that view? We just looked at emotivism. It says it's a non-cognitivist view. So when I ask you all that poll, what do you take yourself to be doing when you make a moral judgment, or what do you take other people to do when they're making moral judgments? I'm asking you this question. Do you think that they're expressing something that can be true or false, or something that is just a statement of preference, like Metallica rocks or something like that, right? So Mackie's an error theorist here, gives us kind of one of the classical versions of this argument. And here's a few passages from him. And so he says, there are no objective values. It's a pretty clear statement of his thesis. And if you want to follow along the file with this, there's a PDF of an excerpt from Mackie on Moodle. So he says, this bold statement of the thesis of this chapter, but before arguing it, I should want to clarify it. And then, of course, and they talk about this in the textbook as well, you know, they go back and forth over really what to name this view. Error theory is the one that's stuck, and so that's the one that we'll use to distinguish it from other versions of subjectivism, emotivism, simple subjectivism, ideal subjectivism. So he says, since it is with moral values that I'm primarily concerned, the view I am adopting here may be called moral skepticism. By contrast, what I'm discussing is a second order view, a meta-ethical view, as opposed to a first order or a normative view. Remember, I introduced that distinction back during the section on the basic concepts in moral philosophy, and here we see that language being used. So these first and second order views are not merely distinct, but completely independent. One could be a second order moral skeptic without being a first order one, or again, the other way around. Let me point out here for those of you that might be philosophy majors or minors, that is a fairly controversial claim now from Mackie that you could separate, or that first order and second order views are autonomous from one another or independent of one another. That's a fairly controversial claim these days. So then he says another view might be moral skepticism. It could be also called subjectivism, but that is that has more than one meaning. So he distinguishes his view from emotivism here. And so he says, first, what I have called moral skepticism is a negative doctrine, not a positive one. Emotivism says that moral judgments are expressions of feeling, and Mackie's just claiming here they are all false, right? That they're not any. Secondly, what I've called moral skepticism is an ontological thesis, not a linguistic or a conceptual one. Ontology or metaphysics has to do with what exists, right? That's the study of the nature of being. So are there any objective moral values, right? Meta-ethical issue there. So he says he's concerned with ethics. And then one of the basic aspects of common sense morality that is talked about in the textbook is challenged here by Mackie. So he says, I conclude then that ordinary moral judgments include a claim to objectivity. This is that idea that at least some parts of ordinary common sense morality include that some claims are at least straightforwardly true or false, right? And so that's the idea that he's challenging here. So he says, I conclude it is a part of our ordinary discourse, but he wants to question that. So he says, the claim to objectivity, however, ingrained in our moral language and thought is not self-validating. It can and should be questioned, but the denial of the objective values will have to be put forward not as the result of an analytic approach, but as an error theory. A theory that, although most people in making moral judgments implicitly claim, among other things, to be pointing at something objectively prescriptive, these claims are all false instead of meaningless, like the emotivist claims. So he says it is this that makes the name moral skepticism appropriate. So the error that we're all making, right, in our everyday moral language is that it has this presupposition of a moralist presupposition built into it that we just kind of go along with. It would be like talking, it's like talking about like Harry Potter if they were real things, right? That's moral language is fictional language. So then we get to his first argument. This should look familiar to us already. We've come across a disagreement argument of various kinds a couple of times now. So he says the argument from relativity has its premises in well-known variation of moral codes from one society to another, from one period to another, and also the differences in moral beliefs between different groups and classes within a complex community. Disagreement on questions in history or biology or cosmology does not show that there is no objective truth in those fields for investigators to disagree about. But such scientific disagreement, this is what you were worried about last time, right? But such scientific disagreement results from speculative inferences or explanatory hypothesis based on inadequate evidence. And it is hardly plausible to interpret moral disagreement in the same way. In other words, what we're missing there is just all the descriptive pieces. But morality includes this non-prescriptive element that it looks like you never get empirically or descriptively. Right, so that's really the first argument that he gives. And so I reconstructed it in the following way. This part's not in your textbook, but again, they do mention in the textbook that he claims moral relativism supports his error theory before talking about the oddness argument. And so I'm just filling that out here. So the disagreement is much greater in regard, really it's not even much greater, it's of a different kind, right? In regard to morality than in the sciences. The best explanation for the difference in degree of disagreement between morality and the sciences is that the sciences explore the realm of objective facts, whereas morality is about non-objective judgments. The explanation that's most likely to be true is one that explains all of the available evidence. Therefore, the view that is most likely to be true about morality is the view that morality is comprised of a set of non-objective moral judgments. I did it here as a best explanation argument, as the abductive argument that's mentioned in chapter 2. I think that's probably more faithful to Mackie's original text there than sometimes that it's put as a deductive argument. Questions so far? That should be fairly familiar to us, right? And so, of course, we could worry about argument criticisms of, how widespread is this disagreement really? Doesn't it take place against a backdrop of shared agreement? As it turns out, most people don't think infanticide is a fun thing, but some cultures practice it under circumstances that are pretty harsh, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean maybe that they don't respect the value of life, right? So maybe the disagreement is really surface disagreement or apparent disagreement rather than fundamental disagreement that we skip over because we're, snapping judgments or whatever. Right, then we get to this second argument. This is the oddness argument, and it really has a couple of components to it as well. I've stacked them together as well, which is similar to what your textbook does. Some people will parse this out, A and B being two different queerness arguments. I'm going to treat them as the part of the same argument. So queerness, oddness, it's an argument from oddness. Part A. So even more important than the relativity argument, his claim, is the oddness argument. This has two parts, one metaphysical and one epistemological. So one about existence and one about knowledge of existence. If there are objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. Correspondingly, if we were aware of them, it would have to be some very special faculty of moral perception or intuition, utterly different from our ordinary ways of knowing everything else. The assumption built in here to this argument is that the way that we know things is basically through the natural sciences. And so if it exists, it's a natural phenomenon, but morality doesn't look like that, right? It's got this prescriptive element to it that is non-naturalistic, or at least certainly looks that way. So their existence, their nature would have to be really weird compared to everything that we know exists, and we have to have some kind of special moral perception in order to access that reality. The queerness does not consist merely in the simple fact that ethical statements are unverifiable. That's errors of motivism there. The assertion that there are objective values or intrinsically prescriptive entities or features of some kind which ordinary moral judgments presuppose, I hold, is not meaningless, but false. So here's how I reconstructed this argument. Again, pretty close to what's in the textbook on page 74, the textbook author's version of it. So here's mine. If there are any genuine moral requirements, then they must be A, unlike anything else we know of, and B, intrinsically motivating or reason giving. In other words, in virtue of hearing the command, you are motivated to abide by it. That's what they mean by prescriptive authority. So carrot, internal motivation, stick, external, right? Something I want versus something that happens to me on the outside. Moral judgments are A, unlike anything else we know, and B, not intrinsically motivating or reason giving. Therefore, no moral genuine, there are no objectively true moral requirements. There's the argument from oddness as I constructed it. So